So let's talk about the similarities between military and law enforcement. What do you see there?
There's a lot of similarities between and because law enforcement officers, they all start out as street cops and they see a lot of things. I mean, they see if you're investigating murders, dismembered bodies and horrific crime scenes, and even if you're not investigating murders, you still see that. You're called in on these horrific scenes, and it has to make an impact.
Yeah.
It affects you. There's no way it can't.
Can you introduce yourself for me, please?
Sure. My name is Dr. Richard Stride, and I'm the CEO here at Cascade Community Healthcare in Centralia,
Oh,
Washington.
okay. And what do you guys do here?
We do a variety of things. We're considered a behavioral health agency,
Okay.
and what we do is we do substance use disorder treatment. We do mental health, and we have 6 different offices
Okay.
around, and we have an evaluation and treatment center just down the road
Hmm.
at the Port of Centralia. And what we do there is it's 22-bed facility. 16 of those beds are for people that are detained against their will. So these are people that meet one of 3 criteria. Either they are gravely disabled, they're harm to themselves, or they're a harm to other people.
Mm.
So we have to detain them against their will. So that's what the 16 beds are for. Now, the other 6 are for crisis stabilization. So if a person, we get a lot of law enforcement drop-offs with that.
Okay.
So if a person's out on the streets and they're acting a little funny, or the officer kind of knows them and says, that this person's, because our officers know the community members really, really well.
Hmm.
And so they'll bring them in and they'll say, he or she might be off their medication or something's going on. So maybe they need to be in the crisis stabilization. Now, the police officer can detain them up to 12 hours, but beyond that, they have to have what's called a designated crisis responder. That's only a Washington state thing that has to come and interview them and determine whether crisis stabilization is okay for them or whether they meet one of those 3 criteria. And then they have to go into the 16-bed unit.
Who are okay? So that's interesting. So
Mhm.
the police officers have interaction with them. They
Mhm.
can hold them for a certain period of time. When you said the what's the term you used? Who comes and interviews them?
Oh, is a designated crisis responder. So those are people that are trained in Washington state. They know the rule and regulations,
Okay.
and they come in and interview this person, and they're the ones who determine whether this person needs to be detained against their will.
What's their background in order to be that kind of?
They're mental health professionals with
Okay.
at least a master's degree. Most are licensed,
Okay.
and they've been doing this type of crisis work for
Hmm.
a long, long time.
Okay.
So anyone who is a mental health professional, master's degree, being the minimum, and license can become a DCR,
Okay.
but it's hard work. It's 24/7, so it's not easy.
Yeah. So I found it interesting. We talked a little bit before we started recording how
Yeah.
you got into this.
Mhm.
Tell me a little bit about what did you want to do when you were growing up? It certainly, I don't think it was this. So what did you want to do when you were growing up?
Actually, I wanted to become a police officer.
You did.
I did.
What? Why?
Well, I had I had some really interesting interactions as a teenager.
Hmm.
I had a 1966 Nova Super Sport with a 283.
Okay, now I'm picturing you in this muscle car with long hair, rocking out.
Actually, I had kind of like a bushy hair, it was just kind of weird, but I felt like I was getting hassled by the police,
Okay.
you know. So I ended up telling my mom this. My mom ended up calling the police chief, And he said, we don't target teenagers. We, contrary to belief, we also ticket people who are making inappropriate lane changes and all this other stuff. He said, mostly we ticket adults, not teens.
Hmm.
Mom said, okay, well, I'll tell my son that. Well, I ended up losing my driver's license after a year because of all of these speeding tickets. One was reckless driving, and one was I got caught going 90 in a 55. During those days, it was 55 was the max,
Yeah.
and that was a highway patrol person.
Hmm.
So, and he's the one who actually took me over to his car, and he said, "This is how I caught you, and this is what we do." He said, "You know you're going to lose your license." I said, "Yeah," and he said, "But this is what we do. This is how we radar you, and this, and this is that." And so I got fascinated by it. I was like, "Hmm, that's interesting." So I did some ride-alongs with the local police department after that, and thought, I'm going to do this.
Wow. Okay, so why didn't you pursue the career? What happened?
Well, I belong to the Church of the Nazarene. My family grew up in the Church of the Nazarene, and I always admired good speakers. And we had some really good speakers. Some of our pastors were good, some of them weren't so good. But I admired when they had a good speaker come in, or an evangelist is what we called them.
Hmm.
And I was afraid of speaking in front of people because I didn't really have any confidence in it, but I wanted to do that too. So, long story short, through the process of just going to church and telling people that I felt like that God called me at a very young age, and so that so law enforcement had to take a back burner while I was pursuing the ministry, and so that's really what I did because I wanted to do that.
Mm.
I want to do that too because I was that much into religion and the gospel and preaching the gospel and letting people know the good news,
Hmm.
if you will. But like we were talking about earlier, I found out that there's a big difference between the people in the professorate at the Nazarene schools and the people in the pews. Big difference.
Yeah.
So I started learning a lot about philosophy in school, a lot of religious courses too, because I was a ministerial student in Nampa, Idaho.
Hmm.
But I really enjoyed the philosophy. That was like, hmm, Socrates, Plato, interesting ideas.
Yeah. So at one point you decide, well, you end up not pursuing this.
The law enforcement, right.
Not only the law enforcement, but you decided not to pursue. I don't. I don't want to call it a priesthood or what, a pastor, right?
Well, I actually did. I was a youth pastor for a couple of years. This was prior to going to school at Southern Nazarene University, at Northwest Nazarene University in Idaho,
Hmm.
and then I went to Southern Nazarene University in Bethany, Oklahoma,
Okay.
to finish up the bachelor's degree.
Right.
But I was youth pastoring prior to that in a Nazarene church, and also interim youth pastoring when I would come back for breaks and whatnot.
Okay.
So I did pursue that and graduated and then ended up going to seminary in Georgia. But I really enjoyed it because the Bible spoke to me. It it really did, especially the ministry of Christ, because it was a street ministry.
Hmm.
It Jesus didn't go to the synagogues; he went to the streets.
Hmm.
And so I was very interested in that because I saw how that organized religion sometimes can be very judgmental, but Jesus wasn't judgmental. He took his ministry where it was needed, which was the streets, and that's what I wanted to do.
Yeah.
So I pastored churches in Montana, associate pastored in Arizona, New Mexico. Silver City, New Mexico, and Lamar, Colorado. The breaking point was when I began to feel uncomfortable in in the church because of some of the way that people would who were sitting in the pews would ask me to preach. I felt very called to preach the gospel and grace. So those two things combined, I thought that that was vital to any sort of ministry, because grace means you don't have to be anybody or do anything. It's just offered to you.
Right.
So that wasn't what some of the people in the church wanted me to do. They wanted me to preach hell and damnation and you're bad, you're a sinner.
Hmm.
We all know that, and we all struggle with that. But
Yeah.
why do you have to tell people every Sunday how bad they are? So I knew preaching the love of Christ and the gospel, but they didn't like that. They didn't like it that I was bringing people in the church who were smoking and drinking last night. And I thought, well, isn't that what Jesus did? He got street ministry, he didn't judge people from where they were or who they were.
Mm-hmm.
There are lots of stories about that
Yeah.
in the Bible. But he took them where they were and he said, you're okay the way you are. I'm going to show you a better way.
Yeah. Okay. So how do you get to the position you're in now? Because obviously you don't end up becoming a pastor. What happens that leads you to where you are now?
Well, when that break happened, it kind of been festering for a couple of years, because when my former wife and I were on our way to our second pastorate in Silver City, New Mexico, my son Jonathan died on the way to the church. He died of SIDS. He was almost 6 months old. And having a child die is just life changing anyway. I mean, people who haven't had that, they go, I can't imagine that. How'd you get through it? Well, you do. You get through it because you have to. But that ended up being the time that I started looking at things a little bit differently,
Mm-hmm.
because I was getting counseling voluntarily
Mm-hmm.
for the death of my son. So was my former wife, and but his death ended up splitting us
Okay.
eventually down the road.
Yeah.
But I found it fascinating that the therapists I was working with were kind of saying the same thing that Jesus was saying in the Bible, that, that you're okay just the way you are.
Mm.
And because you're okay just the way you are, I accept you the way you are. Now go and sin no more. Now try this.
Mm.
And that's the way therapy felt to me. And I thought, well, this is really cool.
Yeah.
I'd always enjoyed the pastoral counseling before in the churches that I was in, that I pastored, but it didn't really, I didn't see, I thought preaching was the biggest thing, and the Bible said it was the biggest thing. Pastoral counseling was the kind of thing you do because you're a pastor, but counseling really touched me.
Okay. So you, I think it's fair to say you counsel a whole bunch of different people,
Mm-hmm.
but you have a passion for kind of military stuff.
I do.
Where did that come from?
Well, I think it went back to that highway patrol, Colorado Highway Patrol person that took the time. He didn't have to,
Mm-hmm.
but he said, "Come over here. I'll show you what's going on," and he did. And that's when I first thought, well, this is law enforcement would be the way I want to go.
Mm-hmm.
But I also had a passion for people that were in the military. My dad served in the military. He was a Korean War veteran. Did his training in San Antonio at the air base there. And I was always fascinated by the military too. I thought that was just, it was cool as a child. It was just cool to see a person in uniform,
Hmm.
and so I would sometimes ask my dad, so act like you're a sergeant and tell me what to do. And so he would do that. He'd be like, this is kind of interesting, kind of fun.
Yeah.
He went down and bought me a little Air Force uniform, and because I liked uniforms, it just something that I liked. So going to the military was something that I always wanted to do, but I just never did. I was too busy in school. Eventually, I split from the church and did full-time pastoral counseling and then mental health, and would mix in pastoral counseling with it. But I found that counseling was really a good path for me.
Hmm.
I always enjoyed the speaking after I learned how to do it, because I had a stuttering problem when I was young. So it, it helped me
Hmm.
becoming a pastor and learning to speak in college. So I did that, and it was just a good path for me. Now, the military, I'd always wanted to join, but I'd gone to school. I got my mental health license in Colorado, and I thought, well, maybe I can do something for soldiers, because I've always liked the military. And so happens there was an opening for an Army psychologist in the 1835th Combat Support Unit in Denver, Colorado. So I went and talked to the commanding officer, and he said, yeah, I think we can get you in. So I did. I took the oath of office in 1999 and was with that unit for a while, and then ended up in Washington State eventually.
And you end up as a captain.
Right.
Tell me, so you're is the correct term the combat stress control unit?
Yes.
Okay. What are you doing there?
We are supporting the Combat Support Hospital. So the Combat Support Hospital is where soldiers are taken from the front lines when they're wounded. Now, if the ER docs, if they see that this soldier is having particular issues, it could be early onset PTSD, or it could be angry at the world. It could almost be anything.
Hmm.
Then they refer to the Combat Stress Control Unit, which is located right next to the Combat Support Hospital. And my unit was made up of Army psychologists and Army psychiatrists and mental health technicians. So we were and social workers. So we were kind of a wraparound service for these soldiers, men and women, that were coming from the front lines, and counseling with them. If we could not, sometimes it would be a command referral. During those days, the only conversation you could have in the military that was confidential would be with the clergy, the chaplain.
Mm.
But ours wasn't confidential. And so, because the commander always wanted to know, well, can they return? Are they okay enough to return? Or do you think they're going to cause problems? Or do you think it's going to be an issue? So we'd have to tell them up front, I encourage you to talk to me, but your commander who referred you here, if it was a command referral,
Hmm.
will want to know what we think.
Right now, I'm picturing you. I don't know if you're familiar with this. I'm picturing you with a mustache in the MASH unit. Sydney, I think was his name.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, yep.
So was there any commonalities when people would come to see you or get referred with the guys in the military?
It it was, and this happens in law enforcement, people that I've worked with too. PTSD, the stress. A lot of these soldiers, men and women, were young. I mean, very young. You go into the military thinking, "Wow, this is going to be great." I'll be fighting for my country. I'll be doing some incredible things. Maybe I'll even get a Purple Heart. It's all these fantasies, but they have never experienced the reality of battle. They don't know what it means to be on the front lines and actually seeing someone next to you die, or seeing a Humvee that could have been you get blown to smithereens and body parts are all over. They couldn't imagine that. It that wasn't even, they were thinking heroics and,
Yeah.
it works like video games or whatever they were thinking. But the reality of it didn't set in. I mean, it just wasn't something they thought about
Hmm.
until it happened.
How do you deal with that then? I mean, you have these people coming in that, reality sets in. Does it take a while of counseling? Does it take, or are some people different? Or just some people, just kind of go, "Hey, I got it, doc, we're going." How do you deal with that?
Some of them would say, yeah, I'm okay with it. I grew up hunting. I gutted deers, and I gutted whatever we shot. So it wasn't, they tried to compare it to that. It wasn't comparable because this person was a human being and
Hmm.
those were animals you were going to eat. So there was really not a whole lot of comparison, but they would do that. And sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes the PTSD was late onset. So they would get back into the community, back where they were
Hmm.
with family and friends, and they would be like, "Oh, I can't talk to people about this.
Hmm.
I can't," because my wife says, "Oh, I don't want to hear that," or my siblings say, I don't. Please don't tell us those gross stories." Things like that. But they're like, "This is what I experienced, and so I have nobody to talk to." So that's when the late onset happens.
Is there a resistance? I mean, obviously, some of these guys are getting referred to you. Is there a resistance to some of these soldiers coming in and talking to you?
There is. They're very skeptical because they know, and I would tell them if they weren't a command referral, just referred from the ER, then I would explain to them confidentiality rules and things like that we had in the military at the time. And most of the time they're okay with it. But sometimes they were very resistant. They're like, "No, I'm not talking to you. I'm not talking,"
Why?
because I don't want to get back to my commander, number one. That was the first big thing they had.
Right, right.
Confidentiality.
Okay,
They're just not confidentiality. At least is the way we think of it now.
sure.
Back then. But it was also resistance because they're like, I dream about this stuff. I don't want to think about it.
Hmm.
I don't want to talk about it.
Hmm.
So
Did it
they'd repress it.
did it change over the time that you were in the military? I mean, you were there from 99 to 2008. Did it change those command referrals? Because I've got to imagine it would have been much more beneficial. Yeah, we got a command referral, but that information never gets back to them, so they don't have to worry about that. Did that ever change while you were in the military?
No, it didn't, unfortunately. But I I learned to be vague.
Okay.
you know,
Yeah.
uh, I I would say, yeah, the soldiers dealing with some stuff, but I think they're going to be fine,
Okay. Okay.
and I'd write that in the report. So the commander would be, okay, think they're good to go back. I don't know the details they would tell me, which is good because there's some that did.
Hmm.
I want to know everything they talked about.
Right.
But other commanders were like, no, it's okay. If you say they're good to go, then they're good to go. I don't need to know anything else.
In order to get a command referral, what were these people doing that was a concern to the officer to go, you need to go see the doc?
Just odd behavior, or sometimes it could be anger. Sometimes it could be repressed anger and domestic violence. It could be almost anything that the commander sees and says, you need to go and talk to someone, or there's going to be disciplinary action for you if you don't.
Hmm.
So you need to go.
Okay. I know this is a loaded question. Do you think the military was doing enough for these guys?
back then.
Yeah, just in general. I'm sure it's one of those things where we can always do more, right?
It, always.
But do you think they were doing a good job?
I think we were trying, but we were still dealing with, I mean, you had the Korean vets, you had the World War II vets. It, it was called shell shock, and then combat fatigue, and then the Vietnam vets, we really discovered that it was post-traumatic stress disorder. So it's really a disorder.
Mm-hmm.
It's not just you're tired in battle.
Yeah.
It's not combat fatigue. It's actually a mental health diagnosis. And we only learned that through the Vietnam vets coming back, not while they were there, but coming back, we learned that. So then Gulf War and Afghanistan soldiers, men and women coming back, we understood them better. And so we're better able to treat them.
In your practice, so you were dealing with World War II, Korean, Vietnam today, right?
I didn't deal with any World War II veterans
Okay.
because they were from the era that, you didn't talk about it.
Right.
Uh, they came through the Great Depression, a lot of them, and they're like, or their aunts and uncles or mothers and fathers did, and so they're like, nah, I'm good.
Well, the reason I ask is I was just wondering, did you see a difference between the generations? Did you
Yes.
who I don't want to say who was worse off, but what were those differences?
Well, World War II veterans and Korean War veterans were really, really good at suppressing it because the message to them was depression isn't real. You need to pull yourself up by your own bootstraps. Don't get into this depression thing because you need to get out of it. You need to work. You need to do this or do that. So forget about it. Just forget about it. And of course, they didn't because they were dreaming it,
Right.
and they would wake up sometimes violently, but that's what it was back then. It was like, just don't talk about it. Just don't talk about it.
Yeah.
But it changed with Vietnam. It changed with that generation.
They were more willing to come forward and talk about it.
They were more willing, and there was a lot of things going on in our nation at that time. A lot of protests. There were draft dodgers and draft card burners, and there was all kinds of people, and there was a lot of resistance, and but when the Vietnam veterans came back, they didn't get a parade
All right.
like World War II and Korean veterans did. They didn't get a parade. They just came back and kind of sulked and wanted to not be seen because people were calling them names. Like I heard this from a lot of Vietnam veterans, that baby killer, and you just, and to be fair, war was different in World War II than it was in Vietnam. In World War II, you had an enemy and you knew that they were wrong, and you knew that if you didn't do something, Nazism was going to be worldwide, or imperialism, like in Japan, was
Mm-hmm.
going to be worldwide.
Yeah.
If you didn't do anything, so you knew you had a mission, you had to suppress it. In Vietnam, it was different because you were fighting against sometimes villagers,
Yeah.
and and the North was relentless.
So, is it easier or was it easier for you? You have the World War II and Korean guys that just suppress it. You have the Vietnam guys that are kind of, they just kind of want to hide and, not really deal with things.
Hmm.
Is it easier to deal with this generation who they're more accepting of, hey, maybe I need to talk to somebody?
Much easier, but it's still hard.
Hmm.
It's still hard because the general idea in those sort of occupations, same with law enforcement,
Hmm.
is you don't talk about it. That's still the message that people are getting. You don't talk about it. You're weak if you do.
So let's talk about the similarities between military and law enforcement. What do you see there?
There's a lot of similarities between and because law enforcement officers, they all start out as street cops and they see a lot of things. I mean, they see if you're investigating murders, dismembered bodies and horrific crime scenes, and even if you're not investigating murders, you still see that. You're called in on these horrific scenes, and it has to make an impact.
Yeah.
It affects you. There's no way it can't.
I don't want to make a comparison in terms of who's got it worse,
Mm-hmm.
but do you think that, a military guy, for example, you're going to Iraq, you serve, you see some horrific stuff, but it's a limited amount of time, as
Mm-hmm.
opposed to a police officer who serves 20, 25 years of just continual stress throughout his entire career.
Mm-hmm.
Do you see a difference in the level of how the job affects them?
I think that's a good question, and I would say yes. You definitely do.
Mm.
Now, if you're a street cop in a small rural town, you're probably not going to see the same thing you would if you were a street cop in Seattle, for instance.
Right.
You're not going to see the same thing. You might be exposed to that, and depending on the size of the town, how close they are to the urban areas, you may not see much at all. You maybe going to church with some people you might have arrested 2 weeks ago. You know,
Yeah.
I mean, it's just like that in small towns.
Right.
Yeah. I grew up in a rural town in Colorado, so I kind of understand that rural mentality.
Mm.
But I think law enforcement officers, because they get that message still, that maybe they got in the military, because there's a lot of people who were prior military that go into law enforcement, and they still get that message. You don't want to talk about it. It makes you weak, makes you look weak. Yeah, one thing you don't want to look to a criminal or to the enemy is weak. Don't want to look that way because they'll exploit it. And if they know, of course they will.
The same question I have then for the law enforcement guys and the military guys then.
Hmm.
Have you found it easier as time has gone by and new generations are is the new generation of policing much more willing to come forward and talk with you?
Yes, they are.
What do you think that is? Is it that some of these younger kids haven't served in the military, so they don't have that thing of, don't be weak, or what do you think that is?
Well, I think mental health, behavioral health, that includes substance use disorders, because that's all intertwined here. The message there now is, you know, go and get some help. Talk to somebody about this because we know that works.
Hmm.
Back in World War II and Korean, totally different scenarios though. You just didn't talk to anybody.
Yeah.
But the stigma with talking with a therapist is normalized mostly today, and so people are okay with it.
Yeah.
They're beginning to understand that there's a mind-body connection here. That what goes through your mind, your body responds to, and vice versa. That's just the way that it goes. So they begin to understand that the mind is something that, even though it's non-tangible, it's something that you need to take care of. You need to take care of your brain.
Or I forget to ask this.
Okay.
Is there Is there a good resource that law enforcement can find that if they're having issues, you can find a good counselor to deal with whatever situation they're going for? Because, sometimes counselors have no experience with law enforcement.
Right.
So how do you find a good one for specifically law enforcement?
That's difficult.
Okay.
That that's difficult. If you want to find a good one, then you do your research. If this person has prior military experience or prior law enforcement experience, they can probably understand. But you don't want to go and waste your time. At least this is what I've heard before.
Hmm.
You don't go waste your time with some liberal that that doesn't know exactly what it is to be in fear of your life.
Yeah.
You know, they're more concerned about pie in the sky issues,
Right.
or most law enforcement and military self-esteem might be important, but that's not their focus. They're saying, you don't understand, and they're right. They don't. So do your research if you're going to go to a therapist and you're law enforcement. That's kind of your background, or your military. Go to somebody who understands. Interview them, is what I tell people. Interview them.
Hmm.
So who have you worked with? How long have you been doing this? And those are questions that a good therapist would be like, oh, okay, yeah, I'll answer that.
Yeah. Tell me about your work. We're still talking about law enforcement. Tell me about your work with police departments in terms of fitness for duty. When do you get involved in that? What situations arise?
Usually and on the east side, I had a lot of these.
East side of Washington.
Yes, east side of Washington. So in Chelan County Sheriff's Department and Wenatchee PD, a lot of them, both the Chelan County side and the Douglas County side. Most of the time, it's standard protocol in law enforcement mostly, and I'm sure this is the way it is nationwide, that if you go through a particularly difficult situation, in order to return to duty, your your sheriff or your commander needs to know that you're going to be okay, just like command referrals. They need to know
Yeah.
that you're going to do all right.
Yeah.
And because you've been through a horrific event, I remember talking to law enforcement officers about things that they did in trying to take down a drug dealer or something, and it was horrific. I mean, they feared for their life because they were getting shot at, and some of them even came away with wounds, but then there's also the mental wounds that just don't heal as well.
Hmm.
So the sheriff would always want to know, at least in the Chelan County Sheriff's Department, like I said, I'm sure this is the same way. It is nationwide.
Yeah.
They want to know, is this person going to be okay? Do they need some time off? And most of the time, I would just recommend, yeah, they need some time off. Give them paid leave. Let them get through this. Let them come to a few counseling sessions, not just this one where I'm evaluating what happened and how it's affected them and their family and on, but let them get some therapy to talk through this with somebody who's empathic
Mm-hmm.
and hopefully who understands what they're going through.
How does it work in the for the most part for law enforcement? Do you have the same kind of issues that you had in the military where it's a command referral and you have to tell the commander what's going on? Is that the same way in
It's pretty much the same way in law enforcement, unfortunately.
really?
But but what I do, I see a difference though,
Okay.
because the commander in the military is more aloof than the sheriff or or the commander or the chief in a law enforcement agency.
Okay.
They're much more aloof because they had a lot of soldiers they deal with.
Right.
Not only this person, but they've got, hundreds. In law enforcement, it's not always that way. Of course, in larger cities, it's law enforcement agencies are a lot larger, so there may be that aloofness, but they still know these people.
Hmm.
Maybe they worked, maybe they started out as a street cop and then became a detective, and then maybe they became a captain or a commander or whatever. And so they know them better. And so they're really concerned. I didn't see this all the time. Sometimes I did in the military, but they're really concerned about this person because they know this person. They know their family because they've come to events or whatever.
Do you think that there's still a hindrance though of if you have to tell the chief or the sheriff exactly what's going on, there's still a reluctance by that officer to talk and really tell you what's going on?
There is, in fact, they tell me that
Oh, well.
during the first interview. You know what? I know if I don't say the right thing. I heard this from one person, one law enforcement officer, and on the east side. Uh, if I talk to you and I tell you what's going on, I may not be back here.
Well,
And you need to know I love what I do. So I would tell them, you know, I'm going to listen to you. I'm not going to write a bunch down. And I would tell them honestly, your sheriff or your chief or your sergeant doesn't want to know exactly what you're experiencing. What they want to know is, are you going to be okay driving a vehicle again? Because this happened while you were on duty in your vehicle. And so there's all these triggers. They just want to know you're going to be okay.
yeah.
And so I would tell them, they didn't ask me, and I'm not going to tell them all the details because they don't need to know. Basically, what they're wanting to know is, can this person return? So I would make the reports very vague, and I would just simply say, they're dealing with this. I recommend that you give them additional time off with pay to recover and maybe have some family sessions and maybe have some individual and family sessions. And let's see how it goes in 6 weeks, 8 weeks.
Do you have any advice for people in law enforcement that are dealing with just things, not necessarily, hey, you get into shooting or a traumatic thing, but you're dealing with something every day with law enforcement and it's a stressful situation. Do you have any advice for people that are in law enforcement about how to deal with your day-to-day issues on the job and kind of de-stress? Exercise? Is it, getting an app out and meditating? I mean, what would you recommend?
What I've recommended before is I would sort of inquire about what motivates them, what do they like to do, what relaxes them, what doesn't, and we would concentrate on those things that they like to do and things that relaxes them or things that get pleasure out of, because pleasure and relaxation oftentimes go together.
Hmm.
So we talk about increasing those pleasurable activities, even if they say, well, I don't have time. You have to make time.
Yeah.
You have to make time. Uh, I have never, ever chastised anybody that I've counseled with in law enforcement or military or when I was a pastor. I didn't do that.
Yeah.
I didn't chastise people. I would try to give them tools to help them cope. Meditation, yeah, it's a good thing. Practicing mindfulness, yeah, it's a good thing. But that may be something that they're not into. They're like, I don't want to do that. That sounds stupid. I've had people say that before too. That sounds stupid. I'm not going to do that.
Okay.
I was working with one soldier one time, and this is kind of an interesting story. And He was a vet of the first Gulf War. And his job, his unit's job was to go and gather body parts after a battle. So they would gather body parts. I mean, legs, arms, torsos, heads, sometimes full bodies, but mostly they were dismembered. And he had some real PTSD over that. And he was in he just didn't want to do anything, and he was just after he came back.
Yeah.
Over there, he was fine, but that's like I talked about earlier. The PTSD is late onset.
Mm-hmm.
It definitely was with this person. So what we did is we talked about that, and then I also used hypnosis with this person, and it worked. We would go back under hypnosis. Hypnosis is just one tool. It's not the tool. But we would go back to those days when he was picking up body parts. And he had horrible dreams about these bodies coming to life and ridiculing him and belittling him and calling him names. Of course, they never did in reality, but he dreamt about this. So under hypnosis, we went and dealt with those dreams. And he got to the point where his dreams were still about those people, but those people were telling him it's not your fault. And he was crying, asking forgiveness, because he didn't do it, but he knew what happened.
Yeah.
So hypnosis helped him,
Hmm.
and he was able to cope with it. And suddenly the dream stopped. No longer having that dream.
Wow.
Yeah.
I can't even imagine. What a horrible job.
Yeah. Yeah.
I didn't realize this, and then you and I were talking, and tell me about your work with school shootings.
Well, it happened by accident. I was still in the military in Denver with the 1835th Combat Stress Control Unit. I was also I was working at Jefferson Center for Mental Health. That's in Denver metro
Mm-hmm.
area. And I worked there for a couple of years and then went over to Aurora Mental Health and started working in the crisis unit is what they called it. And we were trained in stress debriefing techniques. And then in April 1999, Columbine happened. So naturally, the first people that were called were crisis workers. And so we were called in.
Mm-hmm.
But I was watching the whole thing play out on television. I was working for Jefferson Center for Mental Health, and I was also working with Aurora Mental Health part-time and deciding between the two what I wanted to do. And I was watching the whole thing kind of play out on television. The cameras were there, the kids running out of the school. There were ROTC guys running out, and there were police officers all around the perimeter. But during those days, that's the way the law enforcement did it. They formed a perimeter. They didn't go in.
Right.
Now it's different. They go in.
Yeah.
So I'm watching this, and I'm thinking, this is just unreal. And then later reports started coming in about the students and the two shooters, Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold. And so we were called in to help in the aftermath.
Yeah.
So I talked to teachers. I talked to one teacher, and he had just incredible story. I mean, he actually saved kids. He was pulling them out of the hallway into a science lab that was in between his classroom and the next classroom. He was pulling kids in. And after this whole thing happened, and he probably saved hundreds of kids. He literally did, pulling them in there. But after this happened, I was talking with him, and he said, I'm not sure I'm going to do teaching anymore. I said, really? Well, why? You saved all these kids? He goes, yeah. If only I'd known that my friend, his teacher friend, was on the other side of the wall of the science lab. Science lab's in between two classrooms. His friend, the teacher that died, he said, if I would have known that my friend was on the other side bleeding to death, I would have done something. I said, of course you would have. But look at the kids you saved. He said, yeah, I did, but this is going to haunt me, he said.
Hmm. So from Columbine, have you studied these school shootings as they've happened more and more?
I have, and it kind of brings up a little bit of PTSD for me when those stories come out,
Hmm.
because of some of the stories that I heard, and I didn't actually go into the library where Dylan and Klebold killed themselves and a bunch of students,
Mhm.
but I went into the school a few days later. It was probably 4 or 5 days later, because the school officials decided they wanted mental health professionals escorting the students back in and their parents in order to get the backpacks that they just kind of left. So they had them all arranged in the gymnasium, and so we were all lined up, taking these kids and parents in, and we did. And the kids were just devastated, because they might have known some of the students that were killed, they might not have, but it was at their school. So,
Mhm.
and nobody's allowed in the library or in the hallway, and some of the other shootings happened.
Mhm.
So I was walking this one kid and his mom to get the backpack, and then he also said he left some books. So he went up to the classroom and got some of his books, and the mom left and thanked me, and I was looking down the hallway. There was a book depository area where they had all the textbooks. And then down to your right was the library. It was all blocked off. And one of the teachers was in there sorting books. And so I just kind of peeked in and said, hey, I'm Richard from Aurora Mental Health. And he said, come here a second. So I went in there, and he said, you see these holes? We're throwing away these textbooks because they have bullet holes in them. But you see these holes in here? And I said, yeah. He said, if these books hadn't been here, right on the other side of the book area, there was a classroom with a bunch of kids. If these books hadn't been here to stop the bullets from going through, they would have hit some of the kids on the other side. And I said, wow, that's amazing. And he said, yeah, I don't want to be here.
So with your work with school shootings, are you is your work focusing more on dealing with the kids and the teachers and the trauma, or are you delving into trying to find out any of the root causes of why these kids do what they do?
Both. I've attended several Secret Service trainings around school shootings and behavior. Secret Service has a entire unit now that's dedicated to looking at behaviors of school shooters and giving law enforcement some hints as to what to look for, and sometimes even doing assessments on people that have been referred.
The
And
Secret Service does this?
Secret Service,
Interesting. I would have thought it was like behavioral science unit at FBI.
they do it too, but there's a behavioral science unit with the Secret Service too.
Wow.
And they're the ones who came up with this criteria for it's kind of a test, if you will. They get in the person's background, they do all this history checking, and then they give a report back to law enforcement saying this person he has the background, or he or she has the propensity maybe to do this, or
Mm-hmm.
something. It's not like they're trying to criminalize somebody
Yeah.
before,
Yeah.
but they're just trying to protect and say maybe this person needs some help or whatever. But they actually do reports. And I talked to the behavioral health unit person. I called him up. I was fascinated. And I said, this is amazing. How do you guys do this? And she said, oh, we do it all the time. We do trainings all over the United States with law enforcement about what to look for. And we have this big manual that they go by. I read their manual. I was like, this is amazing. Good stuff.
Have you found a commonality between why people do school shootings?
There is a commonality. Yeah.
Okay. What is that?
It most of the time goes back to mental health issues that are unresolved, unfortunately.
Okay. So I'm just thinking off the top of my head. I think is it Nashville? I'm wondering, like, for example, one of the shootings that happened was with I'm gonna get this wrong, but like a trans girl, trans boy. I don't know.
Hmm.
There was a female that went in, and it was
Right.
pretty unusual because it was a female.
Very unusual. Yeah.
I'm assuming that there was some sort of mental issue with that, but you're seeing a commonality not just with her, but with other shootings that are happening. That there's some underlying mental health issue.
There's either a mental health issue or there's propensity toward a mental health issue. But you can't rule out, just like the behavioral team told me in Secret Service, you can't rule out
Mm-hmm.
environment as well.
Okay.
So, because those things go hand in hand. Remember we talked about trigger points?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
For mental illness, sometimes it takes a trigger,
Yeah.
and the environment's the trigger. So if you look at the history of Dylan Klebold, and I read the Secret Service report on that shooting, on Columbine shooting, and did of my own research, read books by Dylan Klebold's mom. It's called A Mother's Reckoning, which is a fascinating book because she talks about if she only would have known, there are all kinds of signs. The other thing they said is, this is the behavioral health unit saying the Secret Service, which is true. They said somebody else knows what's going on. Somebody else was told. Somebody else, there was a red flag somewhere and somebody missed it. They just didn't pick up on it.
I'm really interested about the parenting though. How do
Hmm.
you how do you miss that? Is it just you're aloof? These people are teenagers. They don't want to talk with you. Are you not involved? How do you miss that? How do you miss the signs?
Well, if you take Eric Harris, now he was considered antisocial personality disorder, which means that he had very little empathy for a lot of things.
Mm-hmm.
That could be a brain disorder. We never know.
Mm-hmm.
It could be a learned behavior. It's hard to tell. But his father was in the military, and he was very aloof. His mom was very aloof, and so Eric was just kind of on his own. He did what he wanted, and became very antisocial early. His parents didn't recognize it or didn't want to recognize it. Dylan was more of a manic depressive type, but he was a follower. Eric was a leader. Dylan was a follower. And you read all of this about Dylan Klebold in his mother's book, Mother's Reckoning. But she said that there were signs that they missed, and especially hiding gun parts that they should have known,
Sure.
you know,
Yeah.
and weapons and things. but she said she has to live with this, and they couldn't live in Denver anymore. Look at the Harrises, they had to move
Hmm.
because it was just too hard,
Yeah.
and understandably so. But in her book, she describes the inner struggles that she has now over what she didn't know or what she didn't inquire about then. There was a story that was submitted by Dylan to a teacher at Columbine, basically going event by event what they were going to do, even with drawings. And the teacher said, "This is wow, this is wrong." And he was in therapy at the time, and the therapist didn't realize it was going to be taken that far. They thought, "Oh, this is a violent story. It's concerning, but I'm not sure it rises to the level of, really being urgent." Well, now we know.
Yeah, I mean, I gotta assume, but prior to that, nobody thinks that that's going to happen. But now, hey, I'm assuming this, hey, we got to report this because there's a possibility that this could happen.
Exactly. And Columbine really changed everything. I just, it irritates me, but it's understandably that people do this, but they go, this is similar to Columbine. Everybody's referring back to Columbine, or the the person who was going to be a shooter and decided not to, or was caught in intervention, says, "I want to pull a Columbine incident." It's just like,
Do you have an opinion? I've always wondered this about the shooting. We never had them. All of a sudden, Columbine happens. It becomes this thing, and it just seems like now we have all these shootings.
mhm,
Do you think social media contributes to that?
I think so.
Because it is a copycat thing. I want to be famous. What do you think it is?
I think it's a little bit of both. Now we had a lot of people during Columbine, and when I was working for Aurora Mental Health and Crisis Service at the aftermath, there was a lot of copycat calls that were coming in to our crisis department. I can't imagine what law enforcement was getting.
Hmm.
But I'm going to pull a Columbine. I'm going to do this. I'm going to do that. So it's it's almost like some people sensationalize it.
Yeah.
But they were never there. They didn't see the students. They didn't see the faces. They didn't see and of course, I didn't see any dead bodies, but I read about them, heard about them, and now everything's on the internet. Even the pictures of the library are on the internet.
Yeah.
In the aftermath, it's just horrible.
Yeah.
And so that influenced people. They're like, "Oh, well, this is cool." No, it's not. It's not cool. It's life, and it's death, and it's tragedy, and it's something that never heals for parents or the kids that witnessed it. Never heals.
Do you have any suggestions for parents who are raising kids to, I mean, how do you stay on top of it? How do you should we be having more dinners every night as a family? Tell me, do you have any
That would be
suggestions?
nice. That would be really, really nice if we took the time to sit down with our kids. Now they're going to say, "I don't want to talk to you. You don't understand," and you probably don't.
Hmm.
But the fact that you're there and you're wanting to listen and just say, "Well, how was your day?" I I don't hear parents. I'm not blaming parents
Yeah.
because parents are busy. We have all kinds of stuff we're doing, and having children is a great thing, and raising children is a great thing. But we don't. There are some things we miss, and this is not to blame parents at all, because parents are doing the best they can with what they know.
Hmm.
But it would be nice if we could sit down a little more with our kids and have a dinner. Maybe not talk about anything except silly stuff. What happened during the day today, whatever. And that bond is strengthened because of that. And so then they trust you when there are difficult times. They'll come to you and talk to you about it rather than just say, I don't understand.
Do you have any opinions about limiting social media with kids?
I think you need to. The I hear stories all the time of parents just saying, well, they watch YouTube all the time. What do they watch? I don't know. Okay, well, maybe you should know,
Yeah.
because if they're watching violence all the time, then they're going to sensationalize it. They're going to think it's cool because other people think it's cool, to own an AR or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not against that because I have one.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not against that at all.
Yeah.
Actually, I grew up in Colorado. But I think that we need to sit down more with kids and not let them be influenced. They're going to be influenced by YouTube and they're going to sneak watching YouTube. That's just how it goes.
Mm-hmm.
But if you sit down with them and say, hey, I noticed when I walked in, you were watching this. Tell me about that. What was happening there? Oh, it was about this and this and this. Okay. Does that interest you? Just be more inquisitive, I would think, and limiting as much as you can, because kids are going to sneak around. We did. I did.
Sure.
Uh, they're going to sneak around and do things that they don't want to tell their parents about.
Yeah.
And that's natural. That's part of growing up. But being involved as much as you can and letting your kids know you care, I think goes a long way.
I'm going to get this study wrong, but there was a recent study that came out that said that girls are more affected by social media and have a more propensity to commit suicide than boys based on social pressures on, social media.
Yes,
Why is that? I mean, and the reason I ask is I would think boys mature later than girls.
they do.
Why is it affecting girls more then?
Because they're brought up to be pretty, to be sociable, to be kind. Now they have a natural instinct, and I'm not saying males don't,
Yeah.
but they have a natural instinct toward mothering, and it just comes with the territory of having children.
Mm-hmm.
You're attached to this child. Uh, the dad is too, strongly attached, but there's something about that mother-child bond that we know is very, very important. That's why it's important that when a baby's born, the doctors put immediately on the mother's chest while they're doing the umbilical cord thing, because that initial bond needs to take place, and it's important. Lots of studies done on that, about the bond
Mm-hmm.
that takes place. So I think that female brains, at least from what I can understand, are wired differently that way. So that probably has something to do with it. I haven't done a whole lot of research on this, but
Mm-hmm.
just speculating on what I do know about it,
Yeah.
that uh, the females are also more susceptible to pressure because there is a lot of pressure out there.
Right.
And to look this way, with with men, we're kind of like, oh, if I don't shave today, who freaking cares? I don't know. But,
Yeah.
but women have this pressure of looking good, because then other girls will judge them if they're not.
Yeah.
So it's a cycle.
Yeah. Dr. Stride, really appreciate the interview. Thank you very much.
You're very welcome.